Have you ever noticed how loving someone too deeply can feel like disappearing? Not all at once, but piece by piece, until one day you look in the mirror and can't find yourself. This is how the empath is undone, not through betrayal in a single moment, but through a slow erosion. Every time they forgive what is unforgivable, every time they silence their truth so someone else's comfort can live, every time they carry pain that was never theirs to hold, it begins quietly. A sigh that makes them shrink, a glance that makes them doubt, a silence that tells them their feelings are too much. The narcissist doesn't storm into their life with cruelty. It's subtler than that. They drip their unresolved shadows into the empath's open heart until the empath becomes a vessel of wounds that are not their own. Jung once said that what we refuse to face within ourselves becomes projected outward, waiting to be absorbed by someone else. The empath becomes that someone else. Their light turns into the screen upon which the narcissist casts every disowned shame, every buried rage. And the empath, believing this must be what love requires, accepts it. But what they call love is not love. It is possession. It is a silent colonization of the soul. At first, the empath tells themselves this is strength, being able to endure, to forgive, to carry more than most could bear. But endurance without recognition turns compassion into self-erasure. They become invisible, existing only as the mirror that reflects another's needs, never as the flame of their own being. And this is the tragedy. The very sensitivity that makes them extraordinary becomes the instrument of their undoing. They see the wounds behind the narcissist's cruelty, the fragility hidden in their arrogance, and so they excuse it again and again. What they do not see, what they cannot bear to see, is the slow hollowing of their own core. Every shadow holds a lesson. Stay with us, subscribe, and let the journey unfold further. The empath's descent begins here, when love becomes indistinguishable from sacrifice, and sacrifice becomes indistinguishable from disappearance. No one else notices. Not yet. But the empath feels it, in the exhaustion that sleep cannot cure, in the weight pressing on their chest, in the terror of realizing that their voice has grown so quiet it might never return, because there is a truth they will one day be forced to face. No soul can carry another's darkness forever without breaking. The cracks in the mirror. Have you ever smiled in a room full of people, only to feel a cold hollowness inside, as if the smile wasn't yours anymore? That's how the empath begins to wake up. Not with clarity, but with cracks. For so long they've lived as the reflection of someone else's needs, someone else's wounds. They've become fluent in another's moods, studying the shifts of tone, memorizing the silences, anticipating the next eruption before it happens. They know the narcissist's inner weather better than their own, but in learning someone else's map, they've forgotten their own terrain. And then one day something strange happens. The mask slips. It's small, an offhand comment, a moment of cold dismissal, a look that says, "You don't matter." But this time it lands differently. The empath doesn't swallow it whole. They feel the sting. They feel themselves flinch. And for a fleeting second they hear the faintest whisper from within. This isn't love. Jung warned that the unconscious always finds a way to speak. The soul resists silence. No matter how deeply you bury it, the truth presses upward, cracking the surface of denial. For the empath, these cracks appear as flashes of awareness, sudden moments when the room feels too heavy, when their body aches with unexplainable fatigue, when they realize they are constantly bracing for impact, even in supposed peace. The tragedy is that these signs don't come as thunder, but as whispers. And the empath, trained to endure, often ignores them. They patch the cracks. They tell themselves, maybe it's me, maybe I'm too sensitive, maybe if I give a little more, it will go back to how it was. But cracks have a law of their own. They never stay small. Each silent dismissal widens them. Each manipulation deepens them. Each moment of self-betrayal adds weight to the fracture. Until one day, the empath looks in the mirror and doesn't recognize the eyes staring back. They see exhaustion carved into their own face. They see a stranger. And here lies the paradox. The very sensitivity that allowed them to absorb another's darkness is the same sensitivity that begins to alert them something is fatally wrong. Their body, their intuition, their dreams, everything whispers revolt. Jung called this the voice of the self, the deeper psyche refusing to be silenced. The cracks are not just signs of collapse, they are signs of awakening. They reveal the unbearable truth. What the empath called love was actually survival. What they called loyalty was actually captivity. And what they called compassion was actually self-abandonment. This realization is terrifying. Because if the foundation was never love, then what was all of it for? The empath grieves not only the narcissist but themselves. The years spent carrying shadows that were never theirs to bear. And yet inside that grief is a pulse, the first faint heartbeat of something long buried. Selfhood. The cracks hurt. They destabilize. But they also let light through. The collapse of illusion, it begins quietly, like the slow cracking of glass you cannot yet see. The empath notices a word spoken too sharply, a silence stretched too long, a mask slipping in the corner of the narcissist's smile. What was once believed to be love begins to reveal itself as hunger. At first, the mind resists. Illusions are protective. They shield the heart from shattering. The empath clings to memories of tenderness, fragments of affection, stories that once soothed the loneliness. To accept the truth feels like death. For if the one they trusted was never truly safe, then what does that say about all the sacrifices, the tears, the forgiveness that built this bond? The collapse of illusion does not happen in a single moment. It is slow erosion. A drip of contempt here, a shadow of manipulation there. The empath begins to sense the pattern. Apologies that circle back into the same cruelty, warmth offered only when control is secured, promises that dissolve before morning. And beneath it all, the gnawing awareness. This was never love, it was dependency. It was extraction, it was a theater in which I was cast as the unending giver. Carl Jung once said that people do not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. For the empath, the collapse of illusion is precisely that, a brutal confrontation with darkness, not in the abstract, but in the very person they once cherished. This is shadow work at its most personal. It is seeing not only the narcissist's mask fall but their own, recognizing how much of themselves they denied, silenced or sacrificed just to maintain the fragile dream. The emotional devastation is profound. The empath feels betrayal not just by the other, but by their own heart. How could I not see? How did I mistake manipulation for affection? The shame of blindness cuts almost deeper than the wounds of abuse. And yet, this pain is the threshold. To let the illusion collapse is to step into raw, unsheltered truth. There is rage, hot, disorienting, volcanic. Rage at the lies, at the wasted years, at the quiet humiliations endured in silence. But there is also grief, heavy and endless for the fantasy of love that dies in their hands. This grief is necessary. To skip it would be to cling to fragments of illusion. To embrace it is to allow the psyche to bury what was false and make room for what is real. In myth, this stage appears as the hero's descent, the point where they lose everything, where the path vanishes beneath their feet. In alchemy, it is called the nigredo, the blackening, where all structures disintegrate so transformation can begin. The empath does not know this yet. They only feel the crushing weight of despair. But this despair is not meaningless. It is initiation. something shifts in the silence that follows. The empath begins to notice the subtler truth. While the narcissist's mask has fallen, so has their own. They see their buried resentment, their self-abandonment, their desperate hunger to be chosen. It is excruciating, but it is also clarifying. For the first time, the mirror is honest, and in this honesty lies power. Not the triumphant kind, not yet, but the quiet spark of reality. The empath learns to stop explaining away the cruelty, to stop dressing wounds in excuses. They begin to withdraw the energy that once fueled the illusion. They sit in their rage, in their grief, in their shame, without trying to turn it into a story of hope. They let it burn. The collapse of illusion is the collapse of denial. And, though it feels like destruction, it is the beginning of vision. The empath, who once lived in borrowed dreams, now stands in the wreckage of truth. From here there is no return to blindness. The mask is gone. The silence is pierced. And while their heart trembles in the aftermath, it also beats with something new, the faint but undeniable rhythm of awakening. The death of the old self. Every wound is a teacher, but not every lesson is gentle. The empath learns this truth in the silence that follows the collapse of illusion. What dies in them is not only trust in another, but the entire self they once built around that trust. The old identity, the giver, the healer, the forgiver, begins to fall apart. It is a terrifying death because it feels like annihilation. Who am I if I am not the one who absorbs pain? Who am I if I no longer exist to rescue, to soothe, to be the mirror that reflects someone else's need? These questions echo in the empath's chest, not as curiosity but as panic. Without the old role, life feels like an empty room. Psychologically, this is the shattering of the persona, the mask of identity we construct to survive. For the empath, that mask was carved out of sacrifice and silence. It was maintained by denying rage, suppressing longing, and disguising wounds as strength. When the narcissist's darkness exposed itself, it also exposed the fragility of that mask. And once broken, it cannot be reassembled. Grief deepens here. The empath is not only mourning what was done to them. They are mourning the death of the version of themselves that endured it. They remember the smiles that weren't real, the "I'm fine" that meant "I'm breaking," the nights spent convincing themselves that suffering was noble. Each memory feels like ashes falling through their hands. Carl Jung warned that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. For years, the empath called their silence loyalty. They called their endurance love. They called their erasure selflessness. But in truth, it was fate, driven by unconscious wounds, inherited patterns, unhealed shadows. The death of the old self is the end of calling it fate. It is the recognition that what looked like love was actually survival. This realization brings both despair and freedom. Despair because the world they knew is gone. Freedom because from this wreckage something unimagined can be born. Yet the birth is not immediate. First comes the void. The empath feels hollow, stripped of certainty, unable to recognize themselves in the mirror. What remains is a raw emptiness where identity used to be. In mythology, this is the descent into the underworld, the hero stripped of weapons, stripped of titles, stripped of light. In alchemy, it is dissolution, where the vessel must be broken so its contents can be purified. The empath walks through this inner night unsure if they will ever emerge. Their pain feels endless, their silence unbearable. But it is within this void that the first seeds of transformation are planted. The emotional function of this stage is surrender, not surrender to the narcissist, not to the past, but to reality. The empath begins to let go of their resistance to loss. They stop clinging to what has already died. They begin to accept that the person they once were, The one who could be broken and controlled no longer exists. This surrender is not passive. It is active grieving. It is sitting with the truth without numbing it, without decorating it, without running from it. It is learning to be empty without collapsing. And in that emptiness, a strange strength begins to take root. Slowly, the empath discovers that the death of the old self is not annihilation, it is initiation. Like a forest fire that destroys but also clears space for new growth, this death creates possibility. Beneath the ashes of who they were, the first whispers of who they might become begin to stir. For now, the empath does not yet know this. They feel only the heaviness of endings, the exhaustion of carrying so much pain. But deep within, something waits, a self that does not exist to be consumed, a self that is not defined by suffering, a self that remembers its own worth before. The world taught it to forget. The old self has died. The mourning continues, but in the silence of this death, the soil of rebirth is being prepared. The silence of the abyss. The nights grow heavier. Silence no longer feels like rest. It presses down like stone. The empath moves through days as if underwater, sounds muted, colors drained, time dissolving. Even their own reflection appears distant, blurred, as though they are watching a stranger live inside their skin. This is the abyss, not a metaphorical darkness but a lived reality. Energy vanishes, meaning collapses. Their numbness spreads through the soul, a strange frost that touches everything. And yet beneath that numbness, pain burns quietly, like embers hidden under ash. The empath carries it everywhere, through empty rooms, into restless dreams, across sleepless nights. Psychologically, this is the stage of disorientation. The death of the old self has left nothing familiar to cling to. The roles are gone, the mask shattered, the illusions dissolved. What remains is exposure, nakedness to one's own shadow. Jung wrote that one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. In this abyss, the empath begins to see the contours of their darkness, resentments long denied, anger once buried, grief unspoken. These fragments rise like ghosts, demanding acknowledgement. It is a terrifying confrontation. For so long, the empath defined themselves as good, gentle, forgiving, endlessly patient. To feel rage within them feels like betrayal of their identity. To admit hatred feels like contamination, but the abyss allows no disguises. Here, the truth stands unadorned. The empath sees the violence of their silence, the cost of their self-erasure, the poison of their suppressed fury. And yet, paradoxically, this confrontation is the beginning of healing. Emotionally, this phase pulls the empath into despair, but it is a despair with purpose. It strips away denial. It forces them to sit with wounds instead of decorating them with false hope. The empath begins to understand that darkness is not the enemy. It is the unintegrated part of themselves that must be faced. In mythic terms, this is the journey through the underworld's deepest chamber. The hero faces the monsters that cannot be slain with weapons, monsters that are part of themselves. The empath learns that wholeness is not purity, but integration. Shadow is not to be destroyed, but embraced and transfigured. The silence of the abyss also reshapes perception. What once felt like abandonment begins to reveal itself as space. Without the narcissist's noise, the empath can finally hear their own voice, faint, uncertain, but real. Without the constant pull of others' needs, they begin to sense their own hunger, their own rage, their own longing. The abyss becomes a mirror, reflecting what was always there but hidden beneath the compulsion to serve. It is here that the first act of rebellion occurs. The empath admits to themselves, "I am angry," This admission is seismic. For years, anger was forbidden. It threatened love, it threatened acceptance, it threatened belonging. But in this silence, the empath sees anger not as corruption, but as signal, a boundary crying out for recognition. To feel it is to reclaim a piece of themselves once exiled. The transformation is not yet visible. Outwardly, the empath may appear withdrawn, quiet, even broken, but inwardly, the abyss is reshaping them. Pain is no longer only destruction, it is fire working in secret. The ashes are not only what has been lost, they are also the ground from which something unimagined can rise. The emotional function of this segment is endurance. The empath learns to remain inside the darkness without running from it, to let silence carve them, to let grief hollow them, to let rage awaken them. They are not yet reborn, but they are no longer the person who was destroyed. The abyss is merciless. It strips everything away. But in doing so, it creates the possibility of something uncorrupted, something whole. And though the empath cannot yet see it, the silence that feels like suffocation is also the womb of their transformation. The fire beneath the ashes. Anger is not the enemy. It is the part of the soul that refuses to die. For years, the empath believed that to feel rage was to become like the narcissist, corrupted, cruel, unworthy of love. They silenced it, buried it, suffocated it beneath layers of kindness and forgiveness. But rage does not disappear. It waits, like fire smoldering beneath ashes, patient and enduring. And when everything else has been taken away, it is often anger that remains, the last proof that the spirit is still alive. The empath begins to feel it in their body, a tightening in the chest, a heat that rises behind the eyes, a restlessness that refuses to be quieted. This anger is not chaotic destruction, but the memory of boundaries that were crossed, the voice that was stolen, the life that was drained. It is the protest of a soul that knows it was wronged. Psychologically, this marks the shift from despair to defiance. Where grief had hollowed the empath out, anger begins to fill the void with energy. Jung often warned of the dangers of repressing the shadow. To deny one's darker impulses is to hand them over to the unconscious, where they grow distorted and violent. But when brought into awareness, when claimed as one's own, these same impulses become sources of strength. The empath's anger is not cruelty, it is clarity. It cuts through the haze of self-deception and forces them to say enough. Emotionally, this phase is volatile. The empath may feel guilt for finally acknowledging their rage. They may fear it will consume them, that it will turn them into the very thing they escaped. But slowly the realization dawns. Anger is not the opposite of love. It is the guardian of love. It defends what is sacred. It protects the boundaries that make intimacy possible. It is the force that says, I will not be erased. This fire is the mirror of the self. All that we reject in others is a reflection of what we have not faced within ourselves. By the time the empath reaches this stage, survival has already been achieved. The darkness of the narcissist no longer consumes them. The fire of anger has burned a path forward, but the deeper journey is just beginning. It is not enough to escape the abuser. It is necessary to confront the echoes they left inside, because the most dangerous enemy is no longer outside. It lives within. The words of the narcissist, the doubts they planted, the fears they awakened, all of it lingers, hidden in the unconscious. The empath realizes that part of them absorbed the darkness, not by choice, but by proximity. They carry the voice that whispers, "You are not enough." They carry the shame that was never theirs. They carry the impulse to give until they vanish. This is the stage Jung called shadow integration. To look into the mirror and see not only the light, but the fractured, wounded, hostile parts that were buried. For the empath, this is terrifying. They fear becoming what they escaped. They fear seeing in themselves the same hunger, manipulation, or coldness they endured. But avoidance is no longer an option. What is denied grows stronger. What is faced loses its power. And so the empath begins the work of seeing themselves. With unflinching honesty, the mirror does not lie. The image reflected is both tender and unsettling, a soul that has been broken but not destroyed, a heart that has carried both love and rage, a psyche that contains the potential for both cruelty and compassion. This is not a failure, it is wholeness. The emotional weight of this stage is heavy. Many collapse back into denial here, unable to bear the discomfort of facing their own inner shadow. But for those who endure, something remarkable happens. They begin to reclaim their projections. They no longer idolize others as saviors, nor demonize them as absolute monsters. Instead, they see complexity everywhere, shades of light and dark in others and in themselves. This is not cynicism, it is maturity. The empath's gift deepens. They no longer love blindly, they love with clarity. They no longer forgive to avoid conflict. They forgive only when it aligns with truth. They no longer see themselves as passive, victims of fate. They see themselves as participants in a larger psychological myth, the journey of individuation, where the self is made whole through the union of opposites. Philosophically, this stage is liberation. By owning their shadow, the empath dissolves the control the narcissist once held. They are no longer defined by wounds. They are no longer trapped in cycles of projection. They are, for the first time, free to choose, not out of fear, but out of conscious will. In myth, this is the moment the hero does not slay the dragon but absorbs its strength. The empath, too, absorbs the darkness they once feared, transforming it into resilience, insight, and grounded power. What was once poison becomes medicine. The emotional function of this segment is reconciliation. The empath no longer runs from their wounds, nor hides from their shadows. They face the mirror, and in doing so, they reclaim themselves fully. The journey through pain was never only about escaping another. It was about discovering the vast, untamed, unbreakable depth of the self, the birth of the unbreakable self. The night finally breaks, not with fireworks, not with triumph, but with the quiet glow of dawn spilling across a bruised horizon. For the empath, survival once felt like enough. But now, standing at the edge of everything they have endured, survival transforms into something greater, rebirth. They are no longer the person who entered the storm. That self was tender, unguarded, unprepared. That self believed love meant self-erasure. That self trusted masks instead of faces. That self is gone. In its place stands someone new, scarred, yes, but scarred like a tree struck by lightning, roots deeper, bark harder, branches stretched toward the sky with defiance. The empath no longer fears the darkness they once absorbed. They have digested it, metabolized it, and woven it into strength. The manipulations, the betrayals, the loneliness that once hollowed them out now serve as their foundation. The very weight that threatened to drown them has taught them how to breathe underwater. This is what Jung meant when he spoke of individuation, the becoming of a whole self. Not pure light, not untainted innocence, but a being forged of contradictions, a creature of shadow and flame, tenderness and rage, wisdom and vulnerability. The empath's power no longer lies in saving others. It lies in embodying their own, wholeness unashamed. Emotionally, this stage carries both grief and liberation. Grief for the years stolen, the innocence lost, the love that was never real. But liberation in the realization that none of it was wasted. Pain has been alchemized into wisdom. Darkness has been transmuted into clarity. The empath is no longer defined by what was taken from them, but by what they built in its absence. In myth, this is the phoenix rising from ashes. In psychology, it is the integrated self, the human who has faced hell and returned with the fire still in their hands. The empath does not merely survive the narcissist's darkness. They transform it into a source of unshakable inner power. Now, when they walk into the world, people feel the difference. Their silence is no longer submission. It is authority. Their kindness is no longer naivety. It is choice. Their boundaries are not walls. They are gates, opened only for what is true. The empath has become what the narcissist could never imagine, untouchable, not because they are hardened, but because they are whole. And in that wholeness lies a paradox. The empath can now love more deeply than ever before, precisely because they no longer fear losing themselves. The story does not end here. Individuation is not a destination, but a lifelong unfolding. But this chapter closes with a truth the empath carries forward. They are no longer a vessel for another's hunger. They are no longer prey to another's shadow. They are a sovereign self, dark, luminous, indestructible. The final emotional function of this segment is catharsis and empowerment. It leaves the viewer with the sense that their suffering is not meaningless, that their scars are not shameful, and that within their pain lies the possibility of transformation. The empath has not just survived, they have become.